Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. There are multiple times where we read in the scripture that God expresses some level of regret, where God says, essentially, I wish I hadn't done it this way. I think there's none more dramatic than God's decision to destroy the earth through the flood. But there are others. Places again where God relents, God repents. God told Hezekiah, your life is over. Hezekiah repented. God waited. And there's enough of these that it raises some questions. And in fact, we've had some people who sort of planted their flag on these kinds of texts and reached the conclusion that, in fact, God does, from time to time, actually change his mind. Now, I have no quarrel with somebody looking at these texts and saying, oh, this is hard to understand. Of course it's hard to understand. How are we to understand this? Is God changing his mind? I get that. But professional theologians to study these things and end up saying, yes, in fact, he does, that's not so good. Not so good at all. So my task in these few minutes of this segment of the Jesus Changes Everything podcast is to say there's one thing Jesus doesn't do, and that's change his mind. I want us to understand, though, what it is the Scripture's talking about. And I think it's a helpful analogy. I've used it before. I'll probably continue to use it to help people understand the nature of God's acts in space and time. I describe God's role in our world as, in some ways, akin to the role of William Shakespeare. We know Shakespeare as the greatest playwright of all time. There may be disputes about who the real Shakespeare is, or that is who actually wrote these things, but insofar as we know who the writer is, we know that he was the greatest playwright of all time. But what we often don't remember is that William Shakespeare was also a very active and successful actor. And what that tells us is that it's likely that when Shakespeare sat down and determined to write one of his plays, whatever kind of play it is, whatever play it was, it's certainly possible, if not likely, that he had in mind what role he would play when the play reached the stage. Well, God is perhaps the only writer better than Shakespeare. Not perhaps that he's better. He's certainly better, but whether or not there's anyone else, I don't know. But we know that God is the greatest writer. God is a perfect writer, and that God has written his plan from before all time. That God in his transcendence has numbered our days. That doesn't just mean this is how long you're going to live. He's planned everything that has come to pass. And nothing that he has planned does not come to pass. Nothing that he's planned gets changed in the plan. But just as Shakespeare knows that he's going to act in the play, so does God, the playwright, know that God is going to act in space and time. God writes the story, and in the story, God may go from this way to that way, from thinking that, saying this to saying that. God in the story follows the play perfectly. But the play may have him deciding, I shouldn't have made all these people. These people are terrible. I'm going to kill them all. It may have God saying, I told Hezekiah that I'm going to take him out now, but I'm going to give him 20 more years. Any of those circumstances where we see God relenting, God repenting, God seemingly changing his mind, all this is what was planned from all eternity. Now, there are deep, profound, unmanageable, way above my pay grade mysteries that come about in trying to understand the reality that God is both above time and acts in time. I don't pretend to know what those are. Right now I'm in the middle of, I'm in the early stages of reading a rather thick anthology called The Time Traveler's Almanac. It's got 72 stories that have been published in various places on the subject of time travel as fiction, you understand. And there are all sorts of paradoxes that come with that. And the fact that the fact that God is actually above time and in time, creates its own set of difficulties and hardships that, again, I don't know the answer to. But I do know this. I don't flinch when God expresses regret, when God changes his mind, when God repents, because I know this has been God's plan from the beginning. I know that God doesn't get new information that he didn't have that's going to change his mind. It wasn't like God was surprised that the people on planet Earth in the days of Noah would get so terrible and awful. He planned it. He ordained it. And if you have a difficulty grasping the reality that God plans things like floods, or even plans things like the descent into grievous sin that led to the flood, you need to remember this: that God from all eternity planned that his son would be handed over to the chief priests and to the Romans, that he would be mocked, that he would be scourged, he would be beaten, he would be whipped, and finally he would be crucified. All of this was a part of his plan. And just before it happened, Jesus said, "Father, is there any other way?" And he didn't change his mind. We come now in our ongoing series on the Westminster Shorter Catechism to question 26, which question is the third question in a row, unpacking the ways in which Jesus fulfills his role with respect to what Calvin called the munus triplex, the threefold office of Christ. We have considered how he fulfills the office of a prophet. We've considered how he fulfills the office of a priest. And today we consider how he exercises the office of a king. The question reads, how does Christ execute the office of a king? And the Westminster Divines, in their answer reply, Christ executes the office of a king in subduing us to himself, in ruling and defending us, and in restraining and conquering all his and our enemies. Now, I don't want to say, because I'm going to end up doing it just about every week, I don't want to say this is the greatest example of the genius of the Westminster Divines in cramming so much information into so few words. I'm not going to do that, but it is another remarkable example of how much they can pack into so few words. And it begins wonderfully, wisely, and in some ways surprisingly, by affirming that the first thing that we see Jesus doing in exercising his office as a king is that he subdues us to himself. How easy it is for us when we consider the kingship of Christ to lose sight of the fact that before we were brought into the kingdom, we were in fact his enemies. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that if you really want to understand the sovereignty of God in salvation, you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours studying heavy theological language given to us by the Apostle Paul. All you need to understand is what God promised the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 when he says to the serpent, I will put, that is God, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. This is God affirming that it is he who changes us, that after the fall of Adam and Eve, we are all by nature children of wrath. We are all inherently soldiers of the serpent. We are part of the kingdom of the seed of the serpent. But God in his grace has determined that he will draft those whom he has chosen out of that army and put them under subjection of his king, the Lord Jesus. His kingship is exercised in his conquest of our former selves. One of the ways that we describe the work of the Spirit in regenerating us before we come to saving faith is that the Spirit reaches into our chest, pulls from us our hearts of stone, and gives us a heart of flesh. This is martial language, warlike language, the language of conquest. And we are his captives. What a glorious truth. He subdues us to himself. And by the way, that process continues. The text goes on to say, the answer rather, in ruling and defending us. That ruling and defending us recognizes two things. One, in the defending us, that there are enemies out there still that he hasn't been pleased to bring into subjection yet. But in that language of ruling us, it also reminds us that there are things in us that are not in subjection. Jesus, the King, goes to war against everything in me that is not in subjection to him. And that's a glorious truth. He goes to war against that which is in me that opposes his reign. Our sanctification is a part of the process, a part of what Jesus is doing in his office as a king. In case it wasn't clear there, he goes on, or the Catechism goes on and says, in restraining and conquering all his and our enemies. Let me ask you something. Who is your enemy? Who is your greatest enemy? Now, it's been said for centuries now that we fight a three-front war, that we wage war against the world, against the devil, and against our flesh. And you may think, well, gee, the world's awful big, and the devil's awful bad, and so this war with myself is a small thing. Well, no, friends, because that's the soldier, your old nature, that is closest to your front line. Your deepest enemy, my deepest enemy, is not people out there. It's the old man in here. And what a, again, beautiful and glorious thing it is to know that my King, who is the Lord of Lords, my King is at war with that in me. He is restraining it, and he's conquering it. Now, it is also true that he is restraining and conquering all his enemies and our enemies outside of ourselves. He is bringing all things into subjection. I want you to connect. I want you to see the connection between this assurance of Jesus as the King, bringing all things into subjection, with the very first command that we would be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and everything that creeps upon the ground. I want you to see that the dominion mandate given to Adam and Eve is the exact same mandate given to the second Adam and the second Eve to bring all things under subjection. It's not a change. It's not a shift. What's changed is that the last Adam succeeds while the first Adam failed. The last Adam is perfect, whereas the first Adam was not. Jesus wins. This language that he fulfills the office of a king in subduing us to himself, in ruling and defending us, and in restraining and conquering all his and our enemies. It's just another way of saying Jesus changes everything. My precious wife is a treasure hunter. She loves to spend time searching through the Goodwill store. Sometimes she looks for clothes. Sometimes she looks for books. And sometimes she brings home the treasure. Well, not too long ago, she came home with a stack of books, one of which I grabbed off the pile. She had intended it to be used by our sons in their homeschooling, and I'm sure it will eventually, but Dad read it first, not because I wanted to make sure it was okay, but because I knew I'd like it. That particular book is titled Inside Prince Caspian. Now, friends, when I first read the Chronicles of Narnia, I did not read them in the proper order, nor did I read them in the improper order. That is, I didn't read them in chronological order, which is the heretical, modernist, current way in which things are ordered. But I didn't either read them in the proper order of the original publication. It started with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and moved on from there to Prince Caspian. Well, I didn't read them in that order because I happened to find The Voyage of the Dawn Treader in my friend's home and picked it up and started reading it and never put it down. So I didn't read them in the proper order, and eventually I got around to reading all 7 of them, including Prince Caspian, which was, and I'm going to say at this point, still remains my second to the least favorite of the Chronicles of Narnia. But I want to remind you once again that that is still a very good place to be my second to the least favorite, because I love these 7 books. Well, what did I find in Inside Prince Caspian? Well, this book is put together by a professor of English at Asbury College in Kentucky. His name is Devin Brown, and this is actually the second of, so far, 3 books. One, Inside Narnia, was the first, then this one, and then there's also an Inside the Dawn Treader. And I ate it up. And I'm going to tell you, it didn't rise to succeed my fourth or third to the least favorite after reading this, but it did improve its standing nonetheless reading through this, because what Devin Brown does is just take you by the hand and lead you through the chapters of the book, and gives you along the way just beautiful little pieces. It might be something that he has learned in his research about the process that Lewis went through when he was writing the book. It might be a little rabbit trail about Lewis choosing names of characters, particularly in Prince Caspian. It's not so much or merely the names. It's also in this why he has Trumpkin giving these alliterative kind of oaths kind of thing. When he gets mad, it's that's not, I don't have it in my head. I want to say bed knobs and broomsticks, but that's not it either. But that's the kind of objection he would make. He gives us some insight into the conversations that went on among the Inklings, that group of friends that would meet and read together from the works that they were working on at the Eagle and the Child pub there in either in Cambridge or Oxford. I'm sorry, I can't remember which. So you just get all sorts of little nuggets of insight that you wouldn't know otherwise, except for his research. But you also get some very good and healthy, strong, well done literary analysis from Dr. Brown. You don't get a lot of unpacking of the theological themes, which is just fine. It's not an allegory. It's a story. You do get connections between, well, here's how Lewis explored this same theme in Paralandra, or here's how this same concept comes up in That Hideous Strength. I mean, just all sorts of sort of cross Lewis references across the whole corpus of Lewis's writing. So it was like, that's a good way to put it. I think I'd describe it this way. For many years, I had a very close personal friendship with a fellow who used to play Major League Baseball. And he's a great man. In fact, I've always said he's the best man I know. I still believe it. I miss him. I love him. But one of the things I loved about him is that he was so patient with me when I would ask him questions about the life of a Major League Baseball player. Well, how did this work? How did that? It wasn't tips on how to hit or how to pitch or any of it. How did this happen? How did this work? How did that work? I wanted to find out what it was like to be in the clubhouse, what it's like to be in the away clubhouse, what the traveling was like. How do they handle this? How do they handle that? That's just the kind of guy I am. I mean, I remember being on the battleship USS Missouri in Hawaii and being given a tour, and I really wasn't that interested in what happened when the Japanese surrendered there. I wanted to know what it was like to live on the ship. Same thing with my friend Mark Dewey. What was it like to be a Major League Baseball player? Well, those conversations, it's like having that kind of conversation with Devin Brown about this book. Well, what else? What else? Well, what about this? I mean, there are places where you have questions. You may have had them all along if you've read the books, and you go, oh, okay, well, that answers that. So all sorts of moments of discovery and joy. And I tell you, one of the things that really pays off is that simply this: Devin Brown clearly loves the Chronicles of Narnia. And it shows, and it's shared. And so it's like a conversation between two friends talking about something that they both love. Let me encourage you to get it. I would love, I hope you can find it somewhere other than Goodwill. I would love to read the other two as well. Again, as per usual, both a fruitful read, but a not difficult read. That's the kind of books I'm trying to get you to get into your library in these curating your book library segments. Easy to read. I read it in a day and enjoyed it, but also benefited from it. It was an investment in my own spiritual growth and my own literary growth, and I appreciate it very much. So please check out Inside Prince Caspian by Devin Brown. It's published by Baker Books, and it's available on Amazon and all the usual book outlets. And as always, if you've read this book, if you're going to read this book, let us know. Contact us. Let us know what you think. Thanks so much. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.